Sean Worsley was a veteran who served his country as a combat engineer in Iraq. For his dedication and service, he was awarded the Purple Heart after returning home, as the Veteran Administration deemed him, quote, totally and permanently disabled due solely to his service-connected disabilities. Back in 2016, Sean and his wife Ebony were on a road trip from Arizona when the couple stopped for gas in the small town of Gordo, Alabama. While waiting, Sean stepped out of his car and played air guitar to the music they were listening to. It was a moment of bliss and joy. The music caught the attention of a local police officer, Carlo Abramo, who was white. He approached Worsley, who was black, and cited him with a violation of the town's local noise ordinance. During this interaction, Officer Abramo told Worsley that he smelled marijuana and asked to search the vehicle. In response to this, Sean showed the officer his legally prescribed medical cannabis card that he got from Arizona that he uses to treat his traumatic brain injury and PTSD that he has gotten from time in Iraq. Unfortunately, the officer, Carlo Abramo, took the card and reportedly remarked, "You won't be needing this where you're going." This is where the flawed legality of the situation is highlighted and the corrupt justice system rooted in the punitive worldview is exemplified. You see, the marijuana laws for Alabama back in 2016 had constructed where the officers had the discretion to charge the offender with a misdemeanor or a felony, where it was only a misdemeanor if it was possessed for personal use, but then upgraded to a felony if it was possessed for other than personal use. Officer Abramo charged Mr. Worsley with a felony because Mr. Worsley also had a grinder and scale, so the officer believed him to be possessing marijuana other than personal use. His medication card from Arizona being completely disregarded, Mr. Worsley was charged with a felony. The felony charge that Sean Worsley got activated Alabama's Habitual Felony Offender Act, also known as the Three Strikes Law. It mandates harsher sentences for repeat felony offenders, and a key provision is a mandatory life sentence without parole for anyone convicted of a Class A felony after previously being convicted of any 3 felonies. This law, ever since it was enacted, has been controversial due to the strictness and lack of judicial discretion in sentencing. It is a direct reflection of this punishment philosophy that has plagued our criminal justice system for many decades. Because of his past record, involving 3 prior felonies at the time before this 2016 arrest, with these prior felonies being a bad check and some marijuana that occurred a few months after his honorable discharge from the U.S. Army Reserves, Sean was facing a web of charges which could potentially lead him to a life sentence. Sean Worsley was forced to take a plea deal so his wife Ebony wouldn't get any charges. He was charged with 5 years probation, where he had to serve his probation back in Arizona where he lived during the time of the arrest. This moment marks the collision between Sean's reality and the state's justice system's punitive worldview, which is a philosophy that sees only a criminal and not a patient. The probation caused a lot of turmoil in Sean's and Ebony's life, causing them to become homeless, which further complicated his probation. This whole situation emphasizes that the system did not care about his service or health. It only cared about maximizing his punishment. A man was getting punished by the country he so bravely sacrificed and served for. How was our country's justice system so blind to context? To understand this, we must explore the worldview that built it. To understand how the system was built, we have to look back around roughly 60 years ago to the Lyndon B. Johnson administration, to the War on Poverty. In her book, From the War on Poverty to the War on Crime, historian and Yale professor Elizabeth Hinton documents how the War on Poverty was a deliberate policy choice that replaced social welfare with punitive control. The War on Poverty was rooted in this punitive philosophy, as Hinton reveals how federal law enforcement programs actually transformed domestic social policies. Instead of simply fighting poverty, these policies were used to expand policing in low-income communities. This shift facilitated the dramatic rise of the carceral state, turning social problems into criminal ones.
The time to enlist those who have yet to join the fight, and we can do this by reaching out to all Americans and asking them to join Nancy's drug abuse awareness and prevention campaign.
For drugs, you'll know what to do. You'll have the courage to stand up for what you believe and say, no. What should you do when someone offers you drugs?
The tough on crime era, with initiatives like the War on Drugs, emerged after the War on Poverty as a response to social and political shifts that occurred during and after Johnson's presidency. The tough on crime era heavily relied on and promoted the punitive worldview by shifting focus of the criminal justice system from rehabilitation to punishment. Political scientist Frank Baumgartner and his colleagues explain how the worldview was sold to the public through policy framing and agenda setting in their peer-reviewed article, Throwing Away the Key, The Unintended Consequences of Tough on Crime Laws. The article presents how policy framing was a huge part of implementing and enforcing the tough on crime policies. Policy framing is a process of presenting a policy problem in a specific way to influence public perception and shape a desired policy response. Additionally, the article brings up how politicians who were for the Tough on Crime initiative used fear and racial dehumanization as a way to convince the public that safety is only achieved through throwing away the key. What was the result of this political and social movement? Well, a report done in 1997 by criminal justice professors James P. Lynch and William J. Sable provided contemporary analysis of the 15 years since the enactment of the tough on crime policies. Two authors argue that the policies were formed from a false premises that unfortunately led to a massive increase in incarceration with little evidence that crime was being reduced. Evidently, number of incarcerated individuals increased from over 300,000 to over 1.5 million between 1980 and 1995. The system was built on false premises, but the consequences were very real. Regarding Alabama, these graphs from the Vera Institute highlight that in 1980, the state's jail population was 4,798, and then in 1999, it increased to 9,129. When it came to the state's prison population, in 1980 it was 6,543, and then in 1995 it went over 20,000 inmates. Overall, there has been a 516% increase in the change of the total number of people behind bars for Alabama since 1970. The Alabama Habitual Felony Offender Act, which was enacted in 1977, is a prime example of the tough on crime policies during that initiative, and also a direct product of this punitive worldview that emphasizes punishment and retribution over other solutions and views offenders as inherently bad. The HFOA acts as a mandatory punishment escalator. It strips judges of their discretion, forcing them to impose longer sentences based on the past, completely ignoring the human being in front of them who could have potentially changed and resolved themselves between a long range of time between charges. This law is a key reason why Alabama's incarceration rate is one of the highest in the nation. It is a machine designed to imprison more people for longer and not look back. Jane Forsey, a philosopher and professor at the University of Winnipeg, wrote a piece titled The Injustice of Punitive Justice. In it, she argues that the punitive model is morally unjustifiable and systematically dismantles the common justifications for punitive justice. Using a philosophical framework, she discusses concepts like hard treatment, which is the deliberate infliction of suffering on an individual by the state, often through deprivation of money, liberty, or life. Dr. Forsey points out how those concepts have logical flaws and potential for cruelty. This piece by Dr. Forsey helps question the moral foundation of the Alabama Habitual Felony Offender Act and the broader tough on crime philosophy that stems from the punitive worldview. An important part in all of this is the where. Where do the victims of the harsh sentencing end up after being subjected to a punishment system and Habitual Felony Offender Act? What was the place Alabama could have ended up sending decorated veteran with PTSD, Sean Worsley? According to a report done back in April of this year by the Equal Justice Initiative, a nonprofit committed to ending mass incarceration and excessive punishment in the U.S., they go into detail about the horrors in the unsafe Alabama prisons. Many families have loved ones die in the Alabama prisons, and they all demand help and change, but their pleas come on deaf ears. They quote AL.com saying, "The state prisons are overcrowded and understaffed. While some of the buildings are falling apart, too many inmates are raped and killed, drugs are readily available, and life expectancy falls at the entrance." And the federal government, under multiple presidents, said all this makes Alabama prisons unconstitutional in their cruelty. The Justice Department and Homeland Security have labeled Alabama prisons dangerous for multiple years, but little change has been done. A system that punishes a disabled veteran for his medicine isn't just broken, it's a reflection of a failed punitive worldview. In his book, Just Mercy, A Story of Justice and Redemption, the author, Alabama's own, and founder of the Equal Justice Initiative, Brian Stevenson, writes a powerful true story about the potential for mercy to redeem us and calls to fix our broken justice system. The book centers on the tale of Walter McMillan, a man on death row for murder he did not commit. Just Mercy exposes the political, legal, and social traps that sentence innocent citizens to prison and ultimately death.
Because ultimately, our humanity depends on everyone's humanity. I've learned very simple things doing the work that I do. It's just taught me very simple things. I've come to understand and to believe that each of us is more than the worst thing we've ever done. I believe that for every person on the planet. I think if somebody tells a lie, they're not just a liar. I think if somebody takes something that doesn't belong to them, they're not just a thief. I think even if you kill someone, you're not just a killer. And because of that, there's this basic human dignity that must be respected by law.
Redemption is real. Documentaries like the award-winning The Farm, Angola, USA offers visual proof of profound personal growth even in the face of life sentences. They prove that people are not defined by their past, and the potential for growth is certainly an option. We need a new perspective, a new worldview to implement into our criminal justice system that has wrongly punished innocent people like Sean Worsley and many others, and has created horrific laws like the Alabama Habitual Felony Offender Act. Dr. Michael McGee, an award-winning psychiatrist and author, conducted a presentation in Nevada back in 2024. In this presentation, he provided a comprehensive critique of punitive justice where he synthesizes philosophical, neurobiological, and sociological arguments against the morality and effectiveness of punitive justice. Dr. McGee argues that punishment is rooted in retribution, which often fails to deter crime and can increase criminality. He exemplifies continuous high U.S. incarceration and recidivism rates to back up his arguments. Dr. McGee is an advocate for restorative justice, an approach that holds people accountable but does not resort to harsh treatment, which was the concept Dr. Forsey talked about in her piece. Models like Norway prove that focusing on rehabilitation leads to safer communities and lower recidivism. All of this finally brings us back to the story of Sean Worsley. In January of 2020, he incurred another felony. His Arizona medical marijuana card expired and he did not have the $250 to renew it, but he kept medicating himself anyway. He was charged with a felony possession in Arizona when police pulled him over for a routine traffic stop. In March of 2020, Alabama extradited Worsley from Arizona and sentenced him to 5 years in prison. Recalling the report earlier about how unsafe and inhumane the Alabama prisons were, Worsley's wife and mother knew this and were terrified about what would happen to him behind those bars. They fought so hard for his release that more than 2,000 people donated a total of nearly $100,000 online. The Alabama Department of Corrections eventually deemed him suitable for transfer, and all that needed to happen was for the judge to exercise his lawful discretion to accept Worsley's transfer into a community-based supervision in light of what so many people recognize to be clear injustice and waste of state resources. Unfortunately, that is not what happened. Instead, they focused on Worsley's history of low-level, non-violent offenses and probation violations. The judge denied the community corrections transfer request because, quote, the defendant has fled this jurisdiction both times he was released, failed to comply with any condition of bond or probation, and has 5 felony convictions, including one he received while on probation. From this court sentence, this court finds the defendant is not a suitable candidate for placement in the community corrections program. The judge wrote, therefore, the request is denied. They were going to throw a fragile, disabled man who sacrificed his health and youth to serve this country into one of the most dangerous prisons in America. Prisons that have been declared unconstitutional and which do not have any semblance of functioning mental health services because he made the mistake of bringing legally prescribed medication into a state where that medication is not legal, and because his homelessness, disability, and the differences between Alabama and Arizona drug laws prevented him from successfully complying with probation. However, after a massive public outcry led by advocates and veterans, the Alabama Board of Pardons and Paroles finally granted him parole in October of 2020. And in a final tragic irony, just 1 year later, Alabama passed Senate Bill 46, creating a legal medical cannabis program. The state finally admitted that the medicine Sean was arrested for all that time ago has legitimate value. But that change came too late for Sean. His story isn't a question, it's an answer. It is a proof that a system built on punishment without mercy is a system that has failed. It is time for Alabama to choose a different path, a different system, but most importantly, a different worldview.